this was really what Frictionless was kind of started with. If you remember not too long ago, really 2022, 2021, there was a lot of NFTs, there was a lot of memes, people trading those memes. And I remember at the point in time where if you mentioned anything outside of Ethereum or L2s, it was almost sacrilegious. You would get like a weird look and people would be like, what are you talking about? And ultimately, as kind of like DeFi summer went on, it became a little bit more complex to actually build and use blockchains. Users would often be charged $50+ to do a transaction. Engineers would literally remove lines of code to try to optimize for gas and throughput, and we're like, this makes 0 sense. So we ultimately started Frictionless Capital with a thought process that blockchains were really going to move from kind of these more low throughput systems to high throughput. At the point in time, we started it right after Luna, which was not a great time. But we published this article called The Next Frontier of Blockchain Performance, and really what we outlined was kind of, instead of focusing on L2s or kind of a variety of these different solutions, that we're mostly going to be focused on throughput. And throughput was really in terms of bandwidth, and bandwidth was really the limiting factor. But shortly after that, FTX crashed. It was very painful. Everybody hated high throughput blockchains, and we kind of went back to square one. But we kept going and ultimately raised Frictionless Fund 1 in 2024. Slightly biased on Elon just because I worked at Tesla in the past, but I think he's very good generally at thinking about first principles. And here he was doing a podcast essentially outlining what banks were. And I thought it was kind of spot on, and so I want to play this short 40-second video.
And so you can think of banks as a set of heterogeneous databases with that are actually not very secure, and certainly the monetary system, the transfer system of checks is very insecure. Still is insecure. So are credit cards, and it's still mostly batch processing, and it was entirely batch processing that day. So it was not. So payments were. Or money was this like heterogeneous, high latency, low security collection of databases. That's what banks are. And so just from an information theory standpoint, this should be something that can be much better if it can be real time, secure, and just very fast. Essentially, it's just one real time.
High level, what he talks about is banks are not super secure. They're heterogeneous databases. Each bank is one database, and they don't talk to each other. And what would be great is if you can have essentially a real-time database. Back in the day, Elon used to created X, which eventually became PayPal, and he wanted to talk about bringing all the money into a single ecosystem to make it real-time. I think they're a little bit ahead of the schedule. Because I don't think it would have been possible at that time. But I think now blockchains are kind of broadly working towards this kind of like more first principles systems. And so I think what's interesting today is you see all these banks, and they really are global. Banks have their own databases, their own ledgers. If you think about exchanges, they're also really just global ledgers. They do not speak to each other. They do not talk to each other. And really what you kind of had happen is high frequency trading firms around the world really try to arbitrage these different ledgers. And so really a new field came about, arbing these inefficiencies. But the true problem is that they're slow, inefficient, and not very secure. And so what has happened is most of you probably use Venmo. Venmo often is just doing these batching of transactions. I send you $10, we batch that, and then a couple days later we settle. And it's not great. Really what you want to do is make that real time 24/7. And what we ultimately believe is that we're really transitioning, as Michael said, to where trading, payments, really any information, you're going from a couple day settlement to really a couple hundred milliseconds. The speed of light around the Earth from a physics standpoint is 133 milliseconds. So I feel confident-ish that we can get to a couple hundred milliseconds. And so broadly, what we're trying to build here is what would the system be that would allow us to actually enable that. And so really starting from first principles, and really what led us to kind of understanding this transition from these more low throughput systems to the higher throughput systems is what is a single transaction? A transaction is just a certain amount of bytes that has to be sent from me to you. And that's literally represented in how fast your internet connections are and how much you can actually send from me to you. As Pranav said as well, there's kind of erasure coding, you have some redundancies, but generally it's just a certain amount of data that has to be propagated around the world. And so I think these early blockchains, like the Ethereums of the world, we started looking at how much throughput they were doing, and it was extremely, extremely tiny. They were doing less throughput than dial-up internet, which was 56 kilobytes per second. Most people have modern internet connections, if you go even to data centers, which companies like 00 are now doing and getting custom fiber lines, you can have much, much higher throughput. And so what we really wanted to demonstrate here is 1 kilobyte is a really small amount of data. You times that times 1024 and you get 1 megabyte. Do that again, 1 gigabyte, and now 1 terabyte. And we're starting to kind of go from these lower throughput blockchains that were really measured in kilobytes of throughput to now really megabytes. We haven't yet gotten to gigabytes, but I think we are now have the opportunity and the infrastructure is starting to mature where the throughput lines are now starting to be available. We just need more transaction throughput. And it is interesting, we actually modeled this in 2022. This was kind of our seminal piece. These numbers are a little bit outdated as today, but this is what we originally published in 2022. And these blockchains, as I said, are literally doing megabytes of throughput or fractions of that. Ethereum was targeting 1.3 megabytes of throughput, which is like slow broadband. And so we really just felt that this industry was not focused on what you actually needed to scale, which was these much higher throughput blockchains. And as kind of like on the engineering side, how we like to think about things is really in the limits of like, if you push this to 100% capacity, what would that be? And it would really be called this link line rate. If you had a 10 megabyte bandwidth channel, the bandwidth channel would be fully saturated with 10 megabytes of data. If you had 1 gigabyte, you could do 1 gigabyte. And so it's kind of, I mean, the tongue-in-cheek mean, increased bandwidth, reduced latency. It is true. You really never want to kind of stop human progress. You very much want to kind of lean into that with kind of like multi-core performance and really increasing bandwidth connections. So yeah, high-level blockchains are really bound by bandwidth. And so the goal is to really lean into bandwidth. The more bandwidth that you have, the more transactions you can do. And I think this is really kind of the core seminal piece to why at Frictionless we focus so much on this transition is because really these modern blockchains like Aptos, like Solana are really spearheading that. They're no longer limited by kind of application engineers. They don't have to remove lines of code. You can build more expressive applications. What here we've actually done is say Visa is doing a certain amount of transactions, Amazon's doing a certain amount of transactions, Shopify, these more kind of traditional players. But what's that mean in terms of like bandwidth per second? And they're relatively limited. And I think modern blockchains are really continuing to push what will be possible in the future by increasing the bandwidth over time. So high level, I've talked a lot about just the transition from like low throughput to high throughput, but I think the interesting thing is where are we going and why does this really matter? If you think about, again, all these banks as and exchanges as heterogeneous databases, the problem is actually synchronizing that information. And this is broadly, I think, why layer 2s maybe won't be the most advantageous as well, because layer twos are just sending information in, they're not actually synchronizing that information. And so blockchains, as you get higher and higher throughput, really the goal is the synchronization of that data. I make a trade here in New York, I want to go to Japan, or something happens in Japan, I also want to know about that. And so the faster that you can actually synchronize the data, the more powerful these kind of like modern blockchains become. And what we've also started seeing from like an architecture design is that blockchains, historically, Bitcoin had 10-minute blocks, then you had Ethereum, which had 15-second blocks, and generally block times are now getting faster and faster. Aptos is actually down to a couple, I believe like 60 milliseconds, which is now the industry leading. And then on the flip side, what we're starting to happen is multiple leaders. So today, blockchains have to transmit their data to one single point in the world, and then that spot in the world starts to do data dissemination to the rest of the quorum. And this is interesting, but it's kind of like New York is the central place for the world. You have the New York Stock Exchange. But price discovery, if we truly want to make it global, can't happen in one single jurisdiction. You really need different locations around the world that can ingest this. And so one transition that we're starting to see from a architecture design is the transition from one leader to multiple leaders to be able to ingest different types of information around the world. And this is, again, really focusing on cutting down the time to inclusion. I think this is actually the key, hopefully, that will allow us to do better price discovery on blockchain rails than they actually would more centralized venues. And so I think really, if I were to kind of sum it all up, what we're starting to see happen is you have these heterogeneous banks, heterogeneous exchanges, and now they're opting into kind of this shared standard, which is the blockchain. Ethereum, you opt into an Aptos, you opt into a Solana, and you agree upon that certain rules of the blockchain. And that allows you to coordinate information in real time. And so over the long term, we strongly believe these blockchains are trending much more towards kind of high frequency trading. And I think it's a very interesting time because these blockchains are now getting extremely performant. Solana is now leading on throughput, having a lot of application engineers build there, and Aptos is, again, leading on block times and doing a lot of interesting things with Decibel and also Shelby. And so they're both very keen points of focus for us at Frictionless. I feel very confident that we're now kind of entering the application era, which I think is probably the most exciting thing because we've been talking about blockchain and blockchain infrastructure for quite some time. But